Morning everyone, I'm Nick Slavik. I'm the proprietor of the Nick Slavik Painting and Restoration Company. I'm also the host of this show, Ask a Painter Live. It's a weekly Facebook Live show where I use my over 2 decades of painting, restoration, furniture finishing, wallpaper hanging, color advice, expertise to answer any of your questions you guys have, live or otherwise. Now, if you would like me to cover in depth a certain topic, start a new thread. Same thing if you have a question too. Start a new thread on the Ask a Painter Live page and add some pictures, add a description, remind me what you want to do with your particular project. Maybe it's something that you've seen that you would like to replicate. I can help you with that. Also, if something went wrong with a project, let me know, and yeah, I'd be happy to help you out with that. So remember, there is a button to follow me, so every time I go live with my show, you get an instant notification. Share this and like it as well if you like. If you know somebody else who would benefit from this, definitely let them know as well. So today's topic for Ask a Painter 32 is going to be the basics of painting the trim in your house. It's a very, very important important task to do right. It's also a very popular task right now. I would say a good 2/3 of all my estimates right now are having to do with painting your kitchen cabinets and painting the trim, the architectural millwork in your house. So this is a special Monday live edition. Last Friday I could not squeeze in an Ask a Painter. Production just dictated that I had to keep my nose at the grindstone, so I will also be doing another show this Friday as well. If you guys have any questions for that, send those my way. I could use a few questions for that if you wouldn't mind. So basically, I am going to be showing you how not to do this to your trim. I've been conducting a series of experiments in my shop like I do every winter. I test out new coatings, new methods, old methods, new methods on different substrates, things like that. This year, because of the popularity of painting cabinets, I did an entire series of cabinet doors that I got from a contractor that were throwaway oak doors, where I did all sorts of experiments with prep, with primer, with top coats, things like that. I'll be going into that for a show in depth later on. But today I wanted to cover painting your trim. I received a question from Laura Call. She writes, "Hi Nick, very excited to find your live feed and now follow your page. I live in Lonsdale, and my hubby and I are starting to update our home that was built in 2003, or as I like to say, the end of the golden oak era and popcorn ceilings. All the woodwork is that golden oak and needs to go. I want to update all the baseboards, window casings, and doors to a white finish. Short of ripping out all the woodwork and starting new, what processes and products would you recommend for the best outcome? Thank you very much." Wonderful, wonderful question, and again, 2/3 of all my estimates have to do with something like this. So there's 3 basic areas when you're painting your cabinets or your trim. I also do have about a 45-minute treatise on painting cabinets, millwork, other things like that. I went real in depth. It's Ask a Painter number 17. You can look for that on my page, or you can go to YouTube. It's archived there. And also, if you guys have any questions, doesn't have to relate to this, type it in there, and at the end of this explanation here, this feed, I will go through and see what we have. So, like I said, 3 areas you have to concentrate on very, very intently when you're going to paint any pre-finished wood inside your house. Number 1 is prep, number 2 is priming, number 3 is top coat. With prep, the basic procedure, there's 2 things you want to pay attention to in that first step, the prep. You want to make sure that the wood is able to have finish stuck to it. The second part of that prep is having all the nail holes, all the caulk and everything, fill all the seams. Now, most houses, when they have oak or other stained and varnished woodwork put in, a lot of times I found in new construction, because standards of new construction are so low, guys don't fill in the nail holes. And a lot of times on stained and varnished wood, it's hidden. You can't really tell. It's not a big deal. But when you go to paint it, they stick out like little black holes everywhere, and you have to address those. So, number 1, I sand the woodwork. Most woodwork nowadays is finished with lacquer. It is a horrible finish, at least in the new construction area like that. There are a few guys who do lacquer very well. Lacquer is not all lacquer. There is very low-grade nitrocellulose lacquer, there's a mid-grade lacquer, and then there's a high-grade lacquer, sometimes referred to as like a conversion varnish. You will almost never see conversion varnish. I've met a few guys who do it. It's a very picky process, very interesting process. but you will most likely never see conversion varnish in a home. Most of what you see is going to be pre-cat lacquer, which is the mid-grade, or a nitrocellulose. Either way, when I've seen it done, it's done very poorly, and you can basically take your fingernail and scratch that lacquer off the wood. You will almost never run into an oil varnish finish with new construction either, because of production. Guys like things that dry quicker. Oil varnish, you can get quicker drying oil varnishes, but most guys choose not to use it and go to lacquer. Even the quickest drying varnish will not dry as quick as a lacquer mostly. So, number one, most of the lacquer will end up staying on the wood. Windows are the exception because they come in contact with heavy UV rays from the sun and water. You're going to want to address those. If there's wood sashes on windows and you're going to paint them, you should probably remove that lacquer. It's actually very easy. Sometimes even with a medium grit sanding sponge, you can sand that off. It's not a big deal. Most baseboards, most casing, most doors, they're going to have a fairly well intact lacquer finish. You don't need to strip them down to bare. If you were to strip all that stuff down to bare, reprime and start going, you'd basically be at replacement cost for a lot of that stuff. So as a contractor, I always look for a way where if the profile of the trim and the doors are not out of date and they're good and there's a relatively good finish on it, there's many things you can do to paint those. Now, the first part is scuff sanding, and by sanding we're not making sawdust, we're not removing all the finish, we're basically scuff sanding that finish to make it amenable to a primer. When you scuff sand a finish, where you're basically you're not polishing it, but you're basically just roughing up the surface a little bit, it gives that existing coating something that us pros call tooth. Tooth is basically just a rough enough surface so that when you put your primer on, it sticks to it, and it's got something to stick to. So my basic prep procedure, and it sounds like an insane process, but to me this is the basic hurdle to get over. There are other things you can do specifically for other types of wood finishes, but you basically want to scuff sand it, you want to shop vac it off, and when you shop vac it off, you want one of these guys here that roughs up the dust, gets it off of the wood, and then it'll suck up into a shop vac. I have a nice big 5 horsepower 12-gallon shop vac here. I put a cone filter in there, like a fiber filter, and then I also put in one of those dust bags for drywall dust, because drywall dust is normally the finest particle that you're going to be sucking up into there. So that will capture all that little sanding dust like that. Again, might be overkill, but the last thing you want to do is have that micro dust shooting out the backside of that shop vac and filling your house with a cloud of talcum powder like that. So you scuff sand it, you shop vac it off, and then I use microfiber rags. I got one right here. I use these guys, microfiber towels. You can get them at hardware stores, home stores, Target, Walmart, anything like that. They hold water very well, and they take up dust like nothing else. You basically soak them down with water. I choose water for this particular step. And you wring those out as far as they'll go till they feel dry. And then you start wiping down all the rest of that dust off there. The woodwork at this point should be squeaky clean. When you rub your finger against it, it should give a squeaky noise like that. And when you go over about a 2 or 3 foot swath of it with your finger, there should be no dust on it like that. If you do have dust, you just have to tack rag it down again. At this stage, what I do, now that you have a finish amenable to that, we wipe everything down with denatured alcohol and another microfiber rag. This might be belt and suspenders and all that other stuff, but I've noticed in the hardest to paint interior surfaces, when in question, using that denatured alcohol sometimes means all the difference in the world to whether a primer will stick or not. Some guys use lacquer thinner, some guys use paint thinner. Paint thinner or mineral spirits to me can sometimes leave an oily residue or take a long time to dry off or burn off. Lacquer thinner will actually reactivate some of that lacquer and make the finish gummy, or you may actually disturb the finish enough where it'll lose its adhesion, but you won't tell until you put primer on it. So the alcohol seems to be a great substitute for that. It doesn't cost any more than the other stuff. It flashes off right away, so you can instantly prime the stuff, and it basically leaves you with a perfect surface to paint. Step number 2 is the priming. Now, a lot of people, between prepping the wood and priming the wood, will fill the nail holes, fill all the cracks, things like that with a caulk. There's a little bit of debate on this, especially when you're painting exteriors of homes. I never ever caulk on bare wood, because that stuff is the caulk where you can kind of pull it back and it just zips off those corner boards of the house. So it may be overkill, but I always like to get my woodwork primed, and then I go back and fill nail holes, do all the caulking at the cracks, things like that. It, it may or may not make a big difference, but to me as a pro, people expect a certain level of stuff, and I need to take every single precaution that that caulk won't shrink or it adheres well or other things like that. So I like to get a good coat of oil primer down, and for the love of God, use oil primer while we can still get it. There's places like California, some on the East Coast, where you can only buy quarts, and even those quarts are kind of low VOC or water-based, you know, sort of primers and things like that. It's slowly going the way of the dodo. It's too bad, because there are some good replacements, and I'll detail those later when I talk about my experiments that I've done on another show. But you basically cannot get anything that sticks better than an oil primer right now. There is some good odorless oil primers. I've done some experiments with those. They seem to act just like a regular oil primer. I use a Zinsser product called Cover Stain. There are products from every manufacturer that do as well as Zinsser Cover Stain, but you know, as a professional, I need, especially when I give advice over this thing, I need to point out products that are universally recognized and universally available. I get a lot of requests from other pros in different parts of the country and even other countries that say, hey, you should try this enamel, or you should try this primer. It's really, really good, except I've never heard of the product, or if I have, there's no store within, you know, 200-300 miles of me, and I'd have to special order everything. So I try to recommend things that you can go right down to any big box store, hardware store, paint store, and it'll all be there. So for me, Sherwin-Williams makes a great oil primer product. They actually have an Easy Sand product, which is a beautiful product to use. Really, unless you're using professional spray equipment and have a lot of experience, tough product to work with. Benjamin Moore makes some great, all their Fresh Start primers, things like that. As long as you use an oil primer, you will do well. Now, if you're in question of whether your wood is going to be amenable to this finish, you can always do the 2 scratch tests that I always recommend. Number 1 is the fingernail test, where you apply some primer and you try to scratch it off with your fingernail. If that does not come off, I go to the next test, which is the crosshatch test. And I actually have a cabinet door here. This is one of my experimental cabinets. If you can see the crosshatch sections at the bottom here, like this, I conducted a scratch test and a crosshatch test. Scratch test was done here, and I don't know if you can even see the right there, the burnished area from my fingernail. This finish did not come off. And then I also did a crosshatch test here, where the finish performed very, very well. It's where you take a utility knife and you score it in a checkerboard pattern, apply some blue tape over it, burnish it with your hand, and pull it off. And if all that comes off are the things that the areas where you cut, like that, you know, from cutting it, you actually, you know, powder up the finish, or you know, make it not adhere very well. If the little squares in between come off, then you know you have a poor finish, and you're going to have to either do more prep or find a new primer. But if it passes those 2 tests, I've not found a situation where even the fingernail test, if it passes the fingernail test, 99% of the time it will be a good finish and a solid finish. If you're in question, do the crosshatch test too. You know, both of those tests in combination will tell you probably within 99% certainty whether a certain primer is going to stick to something. And as long as you're using a product that's reliable, that's got a track record with it, it's not going to surprise you years later down the road. So that's where my sort of theory of the priming comes in, like that. So you've got your wood prepped, you've got it primed. Now it's time to actually sand the primer. One of the reasons I use oil primer, 2 main reasons: it sticks to everything, and number 2, it actually sands. There's a lot of water-based primers that you can get to stick to something, but then they don't sand. And part of getting a professional finish, especially when you're talking about architectural millwork, you know, 80% of your effort is going to be spent in prep or prepping between coats. The painting is the easiest part, and 20% of the work, it's really not a big deal. People think it's usually switched, that you should spend most of your time painting and a little bit of prep here and there. Sanding that oil primer gets it glass smooth, and then after you sand it with a medium grit sanding sponge or a fine sanding sponge, I take the shop vac again. shop vac all that dust you just made, and then I go back through again, microfiber towel, and you get up all the dust there. This time you don't need to use alcohol. I just use water again, and as long as you're really wringing that out so you basically can't get a drop out of it, you're not going to leave a residue, you're not going to leave a water film or anything like that. All you'll be doing is picking up the dust. At this point, this is when I like to fill the holes and do the cracks on millwork. Now, on baseboard, it's easy. There's the crack where the top meets the wall, and there's going to be a nail usually every 16 inches on center. It follows a stud pattern, not a big deal. After a couple minutes, you'll find what the finished carpenter's pattern was, not hard to follow. I do not use drywall mud for this, it's too soft. I either use a water-based wood filler, which sands easily again, or we use any hard drying patching compound. Some of the vinyl spackles will get hard enough, but still, if you're going to do this, a lot of the time it's better to use a water-based wood filler. It's going to be harder. The only thing you want to be careful for, products like Bondo, which are very, very hard, very, very resilient, they almost will not sand in some cases. So you don't want to fill a house with Bondo and then not be able to sand it because you'll basically ruin your woodwork. So I like a good water-based wood filler. My particular one that I've been using for the last couple of years is a water-based product from Ace Hardware. Again, readily available, inexpensive, and a quart of it will do basically an entire house for a couple bucks. So not a big deal there. I use regular caulk or adhesive caulk or sealant. There's a lot of stuff that's very expensive. There's a lot of stuff that's very cheap. Go for a mid-grade, because even they started implementing a sort of rating schedule for these things. They rate it in how many years it's supposed to last, and even a $2 tube of caulk nowadays is rated for like 35 or 40 years, which is ridiculous because, especially when you're talking about the exterior of a house, you're going to repaint that house between 5 and 10 years. So really, as long as you use a good caulk and apply it in a good way over primer, it's going to last just as long as one of those 60-year rated caulks, which is silly. Yeah, it may last, but you're going to be repainting that house about 5 or 6 times in that time. So to me, it's kind of a moot point. It's sort of overkill. So I just use. To me, more important is a caulk that you can easily tool with your finger and make smooth. You want to apply it with the smallest bead possible, so I barely clip the tip off the end, just to where you can see the kind of pencil tip. And then apply that and just go in small little sections. You don't want it to dry too quick, and then tool it all with your finger. Baseboard doesn't take long at all. When you get into doors and windows, there are, on any door, when you think about the two pieces of casing, the jamb, and that stop in the middle, there are 2, 4, 6, 6 foot 8 inch lines to caulk on each side post, and then same thing on the top. So it takes a lot of time indoors, and corners are always the hardest part for people to get, because you have 3 lines coming in like this, and you have to get it smooth, and your finger doesn't usually fit in there. But do 1 or 2, and you'll get the pace of it really quickly. Not that hard to do, but again, just takes time, just like anything else. So once all your caulk is dry, once all your nail holes are sanded, and at this point, again, if you're making a lot of dust, the nail filler that I use doesn't make much dust at all. I sand it off, and I have a shop vac right next to me. I instantly get that. If you leave a lot of powder on the woodwork, you'll have to tack rag it off again. If not, you can just proceed. At this point, you have your choice of enamel. Basically speaking, there's water-based enamel, there's oil-based enamel, there's the hybrid of the two, and then there's lacquer. If you're not a professional, if you don't have professional spray equipment, you're probably not going to use the lacquer. That, and I'm not a big fan of it anyway. Lacquer has no approved exterior use, and to me, that's sort of a self-evident truth of it's not that, it doesn't guard that well against moisture or water. Now, there are some good lacquers, there are good guys who do good lacquer. I just don't see a lot of them. And the industry standard is a very low-grade finish. So for homeowners, really the only reasons pros use lacquer is because it dries in 30 minutes and you can recoat it in 30 minutes. With any water-based, oil-based, or hybrid finish, you're not going to be able to do that. And in some cases, you have to wait either 8 hours, 16 hours, or most of the time overnight for those things. That's the reason pros don't use that sort of thing. But my mantra and what I preach to other pros who ask me is, this sort of golden question, this golden rule of the paint contractor of Is it better for me as a contractor, or is it better for a homeowner, or is it both? I have plenty of experience with water-based, with oil-based, and with hybrid finishes. Hybrid finishes are now slowly becoming my favorite, only because I have a lot of experience with very traditional woodworking, wood finishing, and historic home restoration. And some of the oil finishes that were done, somewhere between 50 and 120 years ago are beautiful, beautiful finishes. And a lot of them, not only are they tough finishes, they feel good, they look good, and they are just wonderful, wonderful finishes. And you have to remind yourself that a lot of those finishes were applied with a brush, and they are glass smooth, they're hard as a rock, and they have a look to them. It's hard to describe if you're not sort of a old house aficionado, but there's a certain look to traditional oil, enamel, wood, or furniture that is just second to none. So I like oil, but it stays open for a very, very long time, and it would be my preference if there were no other contractors working on these houses. But when I do a new house, I don't have the choice of saying, for this week, nobody enters this house but me, I'm doing an oil finish. There's always another trade that needs to get in there. It's sort of the nature of construction nowadays. So what I found in the last bunch of years is that Sherwin-Williams, Benjamin Moore, they've come out with these hybrid products, which is basically an oil molecule immersed in a water molecule at its simplest form. The water is the vehicle to get the finish from the can onto the wall. Once it's applied to the wall or the wood or whatever, the water evaporates and you're left with an oil finish, or as close to a traditional oil finish as you can. Now, benefits of oil are that the resins are different than a water-based paint, and they dry harder. This can be a little subjective sometime, but all I know is that from my experiments, from all the houses I've done, nobody can argue with me that basically a oil finish or a hybrid finish is harder than a water-based finish. That's sort of non-negotiable. That's a done deal. That's not subjective in any way. It is objectively a harder finish. So for me, is it better for the homeowner, or is it better for me? I want the homeowner to have a finish that will outlast the cabinets, where I want them to be sick of the look of the cabinets, the profiles of the doors, the layout of them, before they're sick of my finish. So I use the hybrid. You still get a little bit of smell, but you're left with a very, very good traditional oil finish, and it's also something sandable too. So if you want to smooth out some areas or promote adhesion between coats, it's actually sandable. A lot of water-based enamels aren't that sandable, and water-based primers too, like I was saying before, are just not that sandable. The technology is not there, the resins are not there yet to make them as good as oil products. Now for wall paints and other things, they're perfect. I would not usually use a wall paint and choose it to be oil or a hybrid, but so for walls, the flexibility, the adhesion properties, the quickness of drying, and the no smell is good for that sort of thing. So I use my hybrid enamels. This one I had an extra can laying around. This is the Benjamin Moore's offering. It's called Advance. Sherwin-Williams has a great product too. For those of you who have used a lot of these in the past, you'll know a lot of differences between them. The Sherwin-Williams product at its satin form is a little bit duller than the Benjamin Moore Advance. The Benjamin Moore Advance is probably halfway between a satin and a semi-gloss in general terms compared to all other products, but it is a very, very nice, dull sort of, this is actually an example of the satin there. It's just a beautiful kind of low luster finish like that. I have great luck brushing Advance and the Sherwin-Williams Pro Classics Hybrid. The Advance has a few benefits in my mind. It's a thinner product, but it covers very, very well. It's got a nice open time. Open time meaning the time that between when you put it on and it dries, there's a certain period where it stays wet. It stays wet just long enough for the finish to level off, but not so long that it starts attracting dust or gets excessive sagging, things like that. Sometimes that can be an issue with oils. Oils can stay open for so long that even if they don't sag, even if they tack up, they'll stay tacky for hours and hours and hours. So if you have some lady beetles in the spring around the windows, or if you have another contractor somewhere kicking up dust, it can really turn that into sort of a fuzzy mess in no time. So the hybrid, like I said, Sherwin-Williams offering, Benjamin Moore's offering, very good offerings. Benjamin Moore just seems to have, at least for my purposes, they really, really dialed it in. And if any of you pros watching now, have any experience with those two, let me know if you have any other experience with those, or if there's other companies that make hybrids. Because readily available products, there's not that many companies who make these hybrid finishes. So basically, I do 2 coats of the Benjamin Moore Advanced, scuff sanding in between coats. The product recommendation is, I believe, 16 hours between coats, that's the number one reason pros don't use it most often. To me, that's not an issue at all, because usually my jobs are of a certain size where you apply a coat, and it's a large enough job where you still wouldn't have time to go back, even if it could dry, and recoat it again. So most of the time I spend most of a day prepping the woodwork for a coat, applying a coat, and then it's sort of closing time, and then we come back the next day and do it. So even in the case of kitchens where it only takes me about 45 minutes to put a coat on every morning, I just schedule other jobs as a pro. I go somewhere else with my crew. We go back to the shop and work on the doors. We go to somebody else's house and paint some bedrooms. To me, it's not even an argument. It is a objectively better finish than lacquer. And having said that, I understand why the industry moved to lacquer. I just don't agree with it. I sort of set myself apart a little bit in that way. So, but after your 2 coats, you should be good. The benefit of like a Benjamin Moore Advance is that it touches up very easily. You're not going to get a whole bunch of weird shiny spots as long as you use a very good brush or spray equipment. Should not be an issue. Maybe I'll go over this cabinet door now. This was one of the most drastic experiments I did in my shop this winter. Now, this started life as probably a cabinet door from the late 80s, early 90s. It does have what I believe to be an oil finish on it. It could be a very, very old lacquer with some oilless resin. Sorry, I just had a message pop up. It could be a very, very old form of lacquer with some resins on it, but from my tests that I've done, I believe this to be an oil finish. It's a fairly good oil finish. They could have applied a little bit more, I think, but that's something you see quite often. On this door, I wanted to replicate what most homeowners would do to their trim or cabinets, given the general advice from a hardware store or a big box store or a very unknowledgeable paint store. This is basically a cabinet door with no prep done and a water-based finish applied. You can see it here. And then I did 2 coats of the Benjamin Moore Advance over the top here. Now, this is done with top-of-the-line professional spray equipment. It is a water-based primer that is readily available all over the country, and it is probably the most predominant sort of, if you need a water-based primer inside, outside, whatever you need, this is the stuff you get. Very inexpensive, but I find it to be sort of the homeowner standard when they bring home primer. No prep, primer right over the top, and it's just ridiculous how you can just scrape primer right off this stuff. And as a matter of fact, I did a preliminary test. If you can see this little area down here, it's sort of cratered a little bit. I did an initial scratch test and it came off. And you can see here, this was bare cabinet door here in this little area. I sprayed my Advance over the top of that, and you can still scratch the Benjamin Moore Advance off, but it sticks better than the primer. So, worst case scenario, somebody who does something like this is better off just putting enamel over the top, which is sort of sad. But this is what you can do. Most kitchens nowadays, replacement cost is somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000 to get new cabinets made, finished, and installed. And you could basically ruin a set of kitchen cabinets like this. And imagine if you had 40 doors, 50 windows in a house, all the baseboard casing, trim, railings, spindles, things like that. You could really put a hurting on a house quickly. So, and sometimes you can proceed, you can get a good finish on it, and you won't know it fails until it actually put into service. If this was going to be the cabinet door right underneath the sink or something that come in contact with water frequently, a couple years down the road, you could end up with a situation like this. Now, having said that, for no extra money, you can buy another can of primer, but this one will be oil. And this one, I tinted this so I could tell the difference between the oil primer and the water-based primer. But basically, you can see my crosshatch test. It passed wildly down here. I have a piece of tape down the middle of the door. You can see this here. One side, I did my full prep procedure to bare wood. This side, I did nothing. And there was minimal and there was minimal changes or differences between my fingernail scratch test and my crosshatch test. If anything, there is a slightly more that came off in the crosshatch test in the unprepped area, but this oil primer, this kind of shows you that prep. Prep is important. I think this this oil primer stuck to this cabinet door particularly well because I believe this to be an oil varnish finish. So in this case, this kitchen or this house, you probably, on its farthest end, might have got away with no prep and just putting oil primer right over the top. And this stuck perfectly. Now, having said that, this is a, to me, it's as a pro, it's still not worth the risk. I would still much rather do the prep because if something goes wrong, you don't want to be lying in bed at night thinking, well, you know, I should have just prepped the stuff. So this is a better outcome than I expect and that I see most of the time. A lot of the times, even good finishes, you know, you'll still get a little scratch off even if you don't prep it. But this is basically, you know, something to show you the power of an oil primer like this. And it doesn't cost any more than water-based primer. You just got to put up with the smell for a little bit. So yeah, so basically that's, you know, painting your trim in a nutshell. That's kind of how it goes. If you guys have any specific questions regarding that, I'd be happy to take a look. I will scroll through and see if anybody's got any questions. Tim, thanks for watching. Tim's an old apprentice of mine. I know a really good realtor in my hometown, Paul. Paul, good to see you tuning in. Allie, thanks for the birthday card you and your family sent this last week. And Tammy, a past customer of mine. Thanks for tuning in here. Chris, good to see you tuned in as well. It looks like James just popped up there. So, all right, I don't see any other questions on there. So thank you guys for watching. I need some topics and I need some questions. Oh, there's Chris Shank. If you guys have any other questions for me, I'll take care of them. Otherwise, I could use some questions for this week Friday. I could use some topics for this week Friday as well. So if you guys have anything in particular, homeowners, if you're curious about the most popular colors, painting techniques, things you can do to your house with just paint, let me know. Pros, we can talk anything. We can talk about entrepreneurship, the accounting for a small business, employee retention, finding and training, my apprenticeship program, marketing, anything you guys want. So whatever questions, whatever topics you would like covered, post those here, post those on the Ask a Painter page, and we will see you guys Friday.